afternoon, I'm Chris Eakin in Hertfordshire, where one of the country's biggest oil depots blew up in flames in the early hours of this morning. Dramatic pictures were taken shortly afterwards showing the scale of this attack, of this incident. 39 people were injured, 2 of them seriously.
This is possibly the largest incident of this kind in peacetime Europe.
Yes, this is believed to have been an accident, and the plume of smoke has been moving eastwards. People have been told to close their windows and stay indoors. There has been panic buying at the petrol stations. Officials say there is no need to. Well, good afternoon. 10 hours on. This is the extent of the smoke still belching out of this oil depot in precisely the same way it did at 6 o'clock this morning. And that's because the fire brigade have effectively had to stand back from this. They've been working to contain it, cooling down neighbouring tanks. We'll see all of this, very dramatic images which we're able to get from a helicopter live and from people's video around the time. At the moment, the fire brigade have yet to launch a full-scale onslaught because they're gathering stocks of concentrated foam from around the country. Now, the M1 motorway has been closed for most of the day as a result of this, and indeed the fire and the smoke could well still go on for several days. Junctions 8 to 9 we're out of our live shot, but in fact junctions 6 to 10, a large part of one of arguably the country's main arterial route, has been closed because it's off to the east of the actual oil depot and has been catching so much of this smoke, which has just belched relentlessly out from 6 o'clock this morning, now against the setting sun off to the west as the smoke moves to the east. And the flames still going because the fire brigade are limited in what they can do. Now, we'll have much more on the eyewitness accounts a little bit later. But first of all, this report from Daniel Butcher on what's happened so far.
The fire is still raging, little chance of it being put out anytime soon. Firefighters are, though, containing it, waiting for the fuel to burn itself out. All this the result of a giant initial explosion. Smaller ones followed. The concern now, the smoke moving eastwards.
The contents of that smoke are clearly an irritant. It can make people cough, irritate their eyes, make them feel nauseous, and clearly for people who already have asthma and breathing difficulties, they will need to be especially careful. The advice has got to be and has got to remain, please keep out of the plume of smoke, stay indoors, close your windows and tune into local radio and television.
It was the biggest explosion in Britain for decades. A dense plume of smoke hundreds of metres tall with almost continuous fireballs rolling into the sky. Millions of gallons of fuel are stored here, and the initial blast was felt up to 100 miles away. BBC correspondent Colin Campbell was reporting in central London when it went off.
I actually can just tell you that I heard a very, very large explosion just behind me a few seconds ago.
Close to the scene, a CCTV camera caught the moment of the blast lighting up the sky like an early sunrise.
We're right next to it. We're the closest anyone is at the moment.
These local lads went straight to the scene with a camcorder against police advice. Their video footage gives some sense of the scale of the destruction at the depot and the intense heat coming from the fire. Across the field, a building was left shattered by the pressure wave of the blast. This man was in the complex when it went up.
A very, very bright orange light, then an extreme shock, and the whole ceiling fell in, and the doors are blown inwards, and knocked me off my chair.
With so much fuel, it's proved to be almost impossible to control this blaze. Fire crews could do little in the face of this wall of flame. Nearby roads, including part of the M1, were closed as emergency services dealt with the explosion, which shook many nearby residents from their beds.
Literally 6 o'clock on the button this morning, there was this almighty bang, and obviously lying in bed asleep, and just the whole family were woken, and the house literally tremored.
I got up and I had to look out the window because there was alarms going off all over the place. Next thing I could see these flames just on the horizon over there. And they were monstrous. They were going up 400 or 500 feet in the air.
Buncefield is one of the largest depots in the country, but experts say they are prepared for such a problem and fuel supply lines will not be affected. Given the extent of the blast, it seems remarkable there haven't been more serious injuries. Windows have been shattered for miles around and some properties have suffered structural damage too. Most of the damage, though, has been caused to the site itself. From the air you can see building after building smashed by the explosion, with many others still in flames. Police say the explosions could continue for some time. And in the failing light, the plume of smoke remains, partly obscuring the late afternoon sun. Daniel Bircher, BBC News.
Well, they are extraordinary pictures, especially from the air, but let me give you an idea of what people around Hemel Hempstead see, and everybody's been turning out, if they've not been in the actual track of this smoke, to have a look and see, because I mean, we're a mile and a half away here, and we've been here all day, and it's absolutely fine. You can't even smell it here. But there's the intensity of the smoke coming out, and you see immediately to its right, actually, it's quite clear, but then it really gets up ahead of steam, and whether you're high or low, you get this sort of pea soup fog effect stretching right out to the east. And so this gives us an indication of what it's like down at ground level rather than what many people in the south of England are seeing from afar. And it's triggered considerable concern from anybody who might actually be in its path, because the health officials have talked about not it being toxic, but about it being an irritant to people who have existing health problems like asthma, for example. Now, this is an issue which has been taken up by the local Conservative MP, Mike Penning, who extraordinarily actually used to be a firefighter himself, and I spoke to him a little earlier.
The local residents are concerned. We mustn't be about the bush. This is a major incident. The toxins are going mostly up. There were no chemical facilities there. This is straight heavy oil that's burning at the moment. Most of the petrol, I understand, is already burnt off. The problem is that this is a huge, huge fire. You could probably fit 4 football pitches in the middle of this fire and still have space. So the fire brigade can't just put it out. It's going to have to be suffocated from fuel. They've cut off the tanks that were pipes supplying this fire. They've been cut off, but there are still tanks in there which are holding fuel. That's the big job at the moment, is to make sure that they don't explode or leak any more fuel. And then the specialist foam equipment is being brought in to actually put the fire out. But that's going to take many hours, if not days.
You've presumably been asking questions about the level of risk for people underneath this smoke. And I say underneath because we can see from the smoke behind us how the thick smoke is higher, but then you get that sort of fog-like effect beneath it. What answers are you getting to that?
Well, I've been as close as anybody can who's not actually fighting the fire. I've been up to the forward fire control area. I've been briefed by the senior fireman in charge and by the police. They do quite rightly say that you should stay indoors and keep your windows closed. However, most of this is going. A lot of the smoke that we can see over my shoulder probably now, a lot of it is actually steam as well as actually the dark smoke, which is the heavy oil burning off. But I'm afraid this happens when you have a major incident. But I understand there is no risk to my residents. If there was a risk, I would insist on an exclusion zone being put and people being evacuated. Some 2,000 people have already been evacuated, and I support that. And there are more that may need to be evacuated later. I've just come back from the hospital. All but one of the people injured this morning have been discharged. We still have one person with quite serious lung injuries. It's at the Watford Hospital being treated. Just proves that if you do planning successfully, things can be done properly.
Do you know how long people would remain evacuated from their homes for?
They'll be kept evacuated for the shortest possible time that safety means that they can. I think there may be more people that need to be evacuated in the next couple of hours. I'm being told that as they start to fight the fire, the smoke level will actually drop from the sky and come down lower. That will mean that they may well want to evacuate more people. If that's the case, we should do it. But we're a great community here in Hemel. We will look after each other. 2,000 people have been evacuated. Only 200 are sitting at the centres, the specialist centres. The rest have gone in with friends and loved ones. And we're just before Christmas. That's a great way to see.
Well, the local MP there, it's very striking how you can see this plume of smoke from so many miles away. And of course it was heard, the explosion was heard from as far away as Holland. But it is very visible, and even from space, you can make out the blackness over Hemel Hempstead, over Hertfordshire, that plume emanating at 6 o'clock and then hanging in the air. The meteorologists have been talking about that high pressure, which of course is giving most of the south of England delightful weather today. But the effect of the high pressure, of course, is to put a sort of lid onto this. It's to stop the smoke from the oil depot rising any further. And then a little bit of an easterly breeze is just poor westerly breeze is just pushing it out to the east, all picked up even from space. Now, afar is the best place to be looking at this, but some people were picked up by this explosion right next to it. Quite incredible that 39 people, 39 to 44 were injured. The figures vary a bit, but all of those minor injuries, except for 2, they're not life-threatening. They're not apparently too serious, those 2 people. That is extraordinary when you look at the nature of the explosion, and especially when you hear the eyewitness accounts from some of the people who were actually next to this at the time. Now, I spoke to one who was a security guard a little bit earlier, a man called Troy Woodland, been a security guard in the building just a quarter of a mile away, and he told us just what that was like at 6 o'clock this morning.
Well, all of a sudden, a very, very bright orange light, then an extreme shock, and the whole ceiling fell in, and the doors are blown inwards, and knocked me off my chair.
And what did you do then?
Well, when I got myself to my feet, I forced the doors open and went outside. I thought the actual building was actually collapsing. And then I walked out and recognised that there was a huge ball of flame right in front of me, that something quite serious had actually happened.
I have to say that, I mean, you know, I'm a mile away from it at the moment, 6-7 hours on, and it looks quite intimidating. That must have been extraordinary to have seen it at that stage so close.
It was extremely frightening, and to the point I still can't get my head around what actually happened, to be honest with you. It was a major shock.
And what did you do then? Run?
Well, no, as I went out, I took it quite personally, as if it was the actual company that was being attacked. It felt like the actual building had been pushed over. When I went outside, I realised that there was debris everywhere. The buildings aside were obliterated. The fronts of buildings were missing, and this huge ball of flame was again in front of me.
You had no trouble getting out of your building, because we've heard how some people were unable to open the doors because they'd buckled in the blast.
Well, luckily I was the only person on site, and I was near the doors going outward. Although I had to force the doors backwards to get out, I managed to get out.
Was it immediately obvious to you what had happened?
It's difficult to explain, to be honest with you. I recognise the fact that it was a major incident, but I couldn't put any sense to it. Everything, all of a sudden, what was generally normal, all of a sudden turned into something which was totally abnormal, and I couldn't put any sense to anything whatsoever at that point.
Yeah, and we've heard how people heard this thing from even as far away as Holland. I mean, I don't mean this to sound like a silly question, but how did it sound like when you were so close to it?
The actual explosion itself was deafening. It put me into a point of shock. As I say, I almost took it personally. It was like somebody had driven into the front of the building. As I say, it made no sense. I realised that all the buildings aside of me were semi-destroyed.
Well, another remarkable account there. You really would not want to have been where Troy Woodland was this morning. Back to our live pictures. Whatever angle you look at this from, you can see the flames, you can see the reflection from them, especially now because the camera actually gives the impression that it's a little lighter than it actually is. It's starting to get quite dark now at Hemel Hempstead. And in a way, the plume of smoke coming out looks all the more threatening for it. It's a very dramatic sight indeed. Not one which everybody's entirely happy with, of course. Now, as well as dramatic eyewitness accounts, we've also, of course, in this day and age of new technology, had at the BBC, we've received pictures from an extraordinary number of people rushing out to take still photographs, perhaps with their mobile phones, and also taking video footage of mobiles and also with video cameras. And like as we've seen with a number of disasters in the last year or two, that really does generate an extraordinary reaction from the public and a great deal of material, and it helps us all see just how spectacular this incident was when it happened. Jane Waugh reports.
Some of the first images after the explosion, flames leaping high into the sky. Mobile phone pictures showing just how intense the fire was. Residents woken by the blast speak of confusion as they tried to work out what happened.
The whole house was shaking. Didn't know whether it was an earthquake or what, and then there was this almighty explosion. All burglar alarms and everything started going off. Looked out the front window and we can see flames.
It's unbelievable.
Those close enough to capture images like this say they could feel the heat from where they stood. One tanker driver arriving for work at the depot described seeing a giant fireball.
It was about 50 metres wide, and then the loudest explosion, the loudest bang I've ever heard in my life. It took me off my feet. I'm not quite sure whether my knees had buckled or whether the blast had taken off my feet. I was just in shock at that point.
And still the images come in as the thick plume of black smoke spreads further afield. Jane Waugh, BBC News.
Well, this is the way to contact us if you have pictures indeed of the actual incident. A great deal of the public have been out looking at this during the day, but if you do have anything dramatic from early this morning in particular, then these are the contact details, the email address on which to contact us. Send your pictures and the Your Pics BBC email address there. Now, much more coming from the scene, of course, throughout this evening, but for now I'll hand you back to Tim in the studio.
Chris, thank you very much. More from you in the next few minutes. You're watching BBC News 24. Our headlines at 16 minutes past 4. The Hertfordshire fire chief says the oil depot explosions near Hemel Hempstead were probably the biggest incident of its kind in peacetime Europe. 2 people are in hospital with serious injuries. 37 others have been treated for minor injuries. A huge plume of black smoke, which can be seen from space, is moving eastwards. Police warn the public to stay indoors. Well, let's across now to our correspondent John Brain, who is as close to the scene as the police will allow. John, darkness is falling, but those flames still burning as intensely as they were earlier on this morning.
Yes, in fact, Tim, I think they're actually burning even more intensely, certainly to the naked eye. It's now 10 hours since the first and the biggest of the explosions, but as you can see from our pictures here, still those bright orange flames going off into the billowing smoke, which is spreading for miles going eastwards. And there have been other smaller explosions. We witnessed one around lunchtime, which sent a large orange ball of flame into the sky. And the police are saying there could be more of these, but they're saying that the fire is contained and that people living in this area shouldn't be too alarmed by that. But those residents have been told that they should stay indoors with their doors and windows firmly closed because there is, of course, a risk from the smoke, though happily for most of the residents here on this side of Hemel Hempstead, the wind isn't blowing this way and you can't even smell anything acrid in the air at the moment. But despite that, the health authorities are urging people to stay indoors.
We were saying that you were as close to the scene as police would allow. Does that mean that anyone living inside or nearer the depot than where you are has been evacuated?
Yes, we understand about 200 people have been evacuated. Unfortunately, the depot itself is on an industrial estate, so it's not hugely populated by residents, but there are some who do live there, and of course the further you move back from the industrial estate, the more houses there are, the more residents there are. And in fact, unfortunately, the position we're in, we're up in a hoist 60 feet above the ground, so we can't actually move the camera too much at the moment. But just looking down, where I can look down now, we can see a row of houses where the majority of the doors and garage doors were actually blown off their hinges this morning when the blast happened. And we've actually seen workmen here through the day fixing those. Windows obviously also shattered, and people also speaking of literally being thrown out of their beds by the force of the blast.
We were hearing the press conference from Hertfordshire Police and fire officers a little earlier, John, and they are still keeping an open mind about what caused these explosions this morning.
Yes, as always with these sorts of incidents, you get a great deal of speculation at first, and the word going around first thing this morning was that an aircraft had got something to do with this, because an airplane was flying over the area at about the time the explosion happened. That was quickly discounted by the police, who say that at this stage at least there's no reason to suspect that this was anything other than an accident. Of course, a full investigation will be held, but of course, while the flames are still at the intensity they are, then that investigation can't get underway, and we're told that it could be a few days before this fire is put out. They haven't actually, although it's contained, the fire service haven't actually started tackling it as such yet. They're basically getting all the resources together. They're getting foam concentrate, which is going to be mixed with water, and then that foam will be put onto the fire in one coordinated effort. They don't want to do it piecemeal, because they say that won't have an effect. But at this stage, that process hasn't even started, and it might not start until first light tomorrow.
Okay, John, for the time being, thank you very much indeed. John Brain reporting there. We have seen some truly dramatic pictures having been sent in the immediate aftermath of those explosions. Let's just bring you some pictures that we've got from Essex Fire Brigade, one of the video cameras that they had close to the scene of these explosions shortly after they started. This obviously is one of the more peripheral fires around perhaps the larger blazes that hit the bigger tanks, but you can just see how this has spread right around, and fire crews arriving. And as we were seeing from the pictures just a moment ago, it does appear that the flames have certainly intensified over the course of the day. It's not exactly clear what time these pictures were shot, but it looks as if they were perhaps mid-morning. Fire crews from other counties joined their Hertfordshire colleagues in the blaze, but you can see quite clearly here the damage done by the blast waves after those initial explosions. Each tank, we're told, inside the Buncefield depot contains about 3 million gallons of fuel. Just looking at the buildings here, you can see that a lot of them have had their windows blown out. Chunks of concrete and brickwork also were knocked away by the force of the blast. And from our helicopter a little earlier on, we've seen that some of these existing tanks, which haven't actually gone up in flames, were buckled by the force of the explosion, and fire officers have been hosing them down with water throughout the course of the day to try and prevent them exploding. Just watching these pictures from Essex Fire Brigade is Ray Holloway, who joins me in the studio from the Petrol Retailers Association. And we were hearing in the press conference a little earlier on today, Ray, that appealed to the public not to panic buy. But what sort of impact will this have on fuel for motorists? Let's start with them first of all in the country.
I think the best way I can sum this up is to say that Hemel Hempstead Buncefield depot is strategically important, but it isn't critical as such to the availability of petrol and diesel supplies in the southeast of England.
Can you guarantee that there won't be an impact on fuel supplies in the short term?
In the short term, we're going to need a little while to restructure the industry to cope with delivery from these other depots. But the other depots are there for a purpose. They're to provide availability of fuel to the southeast. So given 24 hours, it'll be a very different picture.
So the advice to motorists now is, if you've got more than half a tank of petrol, don't go and fill up.
Absolutely. Behave as normal. The critical thing here is that what causes pressure on the system is the motorist going to queue and to suck fuel out of a filling station when they don't need it. Filling stations are not able to cope with the restocking, and of course the supplies will come from further away now, so there is more time needed if that occurs. My real appeal here, and I'm very serious about this, is if you behave normally, it's most unlikely you're going to be inconvenienced at all this week when you need fuel.
Geographically, Buncefield is obviously just northwest of London. We're told it's, the 5th largest depot of its kind. So where will the other fuel be coming from, and where indeed will it be stored?
Well, there are depots north, east, south and west of this particular depot. Northampton to the north, Corryton and East London. To the south you've actually got huge storage depots. It's far down onto the south coast as Southampton, Brighton. And to the west, right along the Thames Valley, there's fuel available into Avonmouth, etc.
And practically speaking, it'll just be a question of sending tanker drivers to these other depots to pick up. Is that really what it comes down to?
Relocating many of the vehicles that will come from Buncefield to these other depots, the drivers working out of these other centres. Clearly all the companies will be dealing with that emergency plan right now. Let me assure you, in the oil industry, there's an emergency plan for everything. And those plans now will be being considered and staff moved to where they will be most useful.
OK, Ray Holloway with that assurance to the public. Please don't panic by your message, very clearly made there. Thank you very much indeed. Let's just get an idea, though, of the traffic and travel situation as it stands at the moment. Let's go to Jules Wilson, who has all the information for us from our travel unit.
Thanks, Tim. Well, the Buncefield Oil Depot is just off the A414 Breakspear Way that leads into Hemel Hempstead from junction 8 of the M1. Now, the M1 is shut, as you can see behind me at the moment, between junction 6, just south of the M25 for Bricketwood, up to 9 for the A5. Now, that's the northbound closure. The southbound is in from junction 10 down to 6 as well. That's coming down from Luton Airport, so a fairly massive closure there. Now, also the exit slips, or the entry slips, closed at 11 and 12. That's the Flitwick and Dunstable turn-off. So you're not already on the motorway from Milton Keynes. It's effectively closed off from the northern perimeter of Luton. Got another closure for the M10. That's also closed at 7 for the M1 to junction 1 for St Albans. So some southbound queues there. Now, the police advice for you is to use the A1 as a diversion if you're heading through Bedfordshire or Hertfordshire, and the M40 through Buckinghamshire. I just have to warn you, we've had a couple of pretty serious accidents there, and that's adding to the rush hour queues for Sunday night as well. Now, Hemel Hempstead itself, the A414 Breakspear Way is closed obviously between junction 8 of the M1 and the Leverstock Greenway. Lots of closures in Hemel Hempstead, particularly on the eastern side of town. Lots of the road services have melted through there. That's causing a few problems as well. And roads through the Leverstock Green area to the south of Breakspear Way have been affected as well. Now, surprisingly enough, public transport not looking too bad. Silverlink and Thameslink pretty much on the move. Luton Airport and Heathrow Airport report some disruption at the moment. That's because of the visibility. They've changed their stacking system, so the best bet for you is to check before you travel. Also, some smoke drifting across London. Now, the M25 has been badly affected at junction 22, and for London itself, that means problems for the Blackwall Tunnel, the A1, particularly down the Barnet bypass, and the Leytonstone and Bow areas as well. Those closures, we are told, will be in until at least tomorrow night. That's it from me.
Jules, there's going to be traffic chaos on rush hour tomorrow. Thank you very much indeed. The smoke from those explosions is now spreading over London and towards mainland Europe. Let's get a weather update now just to see where the wind is going to take it eventually. Over to Darren Bed.
Thanks very much indeed, Tim. Well, so far the spread of the smoke plume has been limited by high pressure that's putting a lid on the atmosphere and the very light winds. But I think by the time we get to tomorrow morning, we're expecting a bit of a stronger northerly wind pushing the smoke southwards, and there could be a bit of rain and drizzle as well. And then following that,